Welcome, everyone. My name is Olivier Krischer. I'm the convener of the Sydney Asian Art Series. And as many of you will probably be aware, this series has been now going for many years as a collaboration between the Power Institute at the University of Sydney, the China Studies Centre, as well as the Art Gallery New South Wales, and especially Vis Asia, that's now part of the gallery. And I'd like to acknowledge their support, which has made it possible. Today is the second event that's associated with our second speaker in the series, Professor Thy Phu. But before I go on, I'd like to first of all acknowledge, of course, that I am living and working on the unceded lands of Gadigal and Wangal people here in Sydney. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And also, I will sort of cover some housekeeping before we get underway. So just a word about the format today. This is a roundtable. And so we're all on screen, as you can see. I would invite you, though, I think we do have quite a number of attendees today, so I'll invite you to post your questions to the Q&A. For those who are unfamiliar, there should be a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If it's wide enough, it will pop up if you hover over the bottom of your screen. If your screen's a little bit smaller, like mine today, actually, you might find that it's condensed into a sort of ... tab, and you'll find it there. So you can post questions to the Q&A, and I'll be moderating those as we go along. I've prepared some questions as well. And so we'll have a good hour or so to chat with the editorial group of TransAsia Photography. I'll say a little bit about the series, and then I'll ask each of our panelists today to introduce themselves. The title of our series this year, Troubling Images, works intentionally in two different directions. So on the one hand, it recognizes that images have the ability, the power to trouble and challenge, but also that troubling images is a way of referring to the kind of research, which I think is timely for what we're talking about today, that can unsettle or provoke new understandings of photographic images, history, and practice. Last week, Thy Phu, who is sort of on the bottom of my screen, maybe wave if you can, Thy. There she is. So Thy Phu gave a wonderful talk, Warring Visions of Vietnam, Pictorial and the Colors of Socialist Futurity, which is a part, sharing part of her recent book. And Thy wears many hats, and one of them, of course, is as co-editor of TransAsia Photography Journal, which has been really formative in the field. And so when we were organizing Thy's talks, I thought it would be great to invite her to bring her co-editors into the conversation in this roundtable. It seemed a really good opportunity, particularly because, as many of you will know, the editorial sort of group, collective, if I could call it that, I think is probably apt, is new to TransAsia Photography, despite the journal's 10 years of history. And that's something we'll talk about today. So I'm really delighted, in addition to welcoming Thy Phu, who is a professor at the University of Toronto, we're welcoming her colleagues. So Yi, who's here, is Associate Professor of Chinese Modern and Contemporary Art and Visual Culture, also at the University of Toronto, and Deepali Dewan, who joins us both as an associate professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Art, but she's also the Dan Mishra Curator of South Asian Art and Culture at the Royal Ontario Museum. So what we plan to do, I was going to hand over now for some self-introduction, just to bring our panel into the conversation to begin with, and then I'll sort of kick things off with a question. So I introduce you all to, I invite you all to unmute yourselves, and maybe I'll start, Thy, with you as our sort of speaker in the series, and then we'll hand over to Yi and Deepali.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be joining you again. I guess I almost feel like you all already know something about me, but I have actually, this is the second journal that I've co-edited. I guess that's another thing that you might not know. I was previously co-editor of photography and culture, which is a more general kind of journal that advances research in photography. And maybe we can talk about what is distinct about Trans-Asia photography, given all the other journals that exist in the scholarly study of photography. But it's really a thrill to be able to work with Deepali and Yi on this journal, because we saw, as you'll shortly hear us speak about, an opportunity to kind of advance this area of research.
We go for it.
Hi, it's really an honor to be here. I would like to thank Olivier, Nick, and the team for Sydney Asian Art Series. Since this is my first participation, I would like to introduce a little bit more about what I do, my experience with the study of Asian photography. So my name is Yi Gu. I'm trained as an art historian. My field is modern and contemporary Chinese art and visual culture. Even though I write a lot about photography from the moment when photography was introduced to China all the way to Cultural Revolution, but my first book is actually on painting, Chinese ways of seeing and open air painting. The book I'm currently working on is actually on socialist data visualization. However, photography really configures, photography is a very unique presence in both my personal growth and intellectual inquiry. Because previously, I don't even know whether T and Deepali knows about this. I used to be a pre-modernist. So I was, my master actually is in archaeology. My MA thesis is on Han Dynasty mausoleum. So it was when I took a seminar on photography, I became really, really interested in this media. And ever since that, then became a very happy modernist. So almost in every project I work on right now, even when the title itself does not feature photography, the photographic media, the modes of photographic seeing is actually very important in all of them. So it's really my honor to be able to serve and kind of give back to the field of photo studies of Asia. And yes, I'm very happy and proud to be a collaborator with my co-editors, Deepali and T. Yeah.
Thanks, Gui, and delighted to sort of, that was another kind of strategy really, it was to try and bring in more voices that I've sort of had in mind, you know, all of your research over the years. So Deepali, can we hear a little bit about, also you have quite a diverse kind of practice and background.
Sure, good morning everybody, and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So my name's Deepali Dewan, and I'm also trained as an art historian. My area is South Asia and its diasporas. And I kind of also do the whole gamut in my curatorial work, but my research work is very much focused on the history and theory of photography in India. And the issues that I'm interested in range from migration, vernacular photography in particular, issues of the production of knowledge and critical historiography. I've written books on 19th century and 20th century photography in India. The photographer Raja Deen Dayal, who was a court photographer and also set up studios in some of the main, what are now cosmopolitan spaces of India, but then also painted photography in India. And my current book project is actually on a history of photography in India. And I've been interested also in thinking about the relationship between family photography and migration. You know, this journal has been really an important part of, I think, my learning and education in the past. And I was fortunate enough to guest edit a issue on family photography of several years ago. But coming together and being part of a team that actually can shape sort of where the journal goes felt like a really important activity to be able to think about where the field could go. And it's been really wonderful. In fact, I feel like, you know, T and E and I have been in this intense kind of conversation about both the practical sides of running a journal, which we kind of had a very, maybe T was more experienced, but it was quite the crash course over this last year. But then also the more intellectual, conceptual sides of it. And it's been, I think, a really nice balance. We each bring different things to the table. And it's nice to kind of open this conversation we've been having in a very insular way into a bit more of a public forum today.
Thanks, Deepali. And I think it's interesting that you do sort of bring up the practical challenges, because that's something that I want to ask about as well. Because it is, I think, still rather unique as a journal, not only in the field, but in its format, being completely online. That's something we'll get to. My questions, I'll kind of jump in. We've had a chat about how this might work today, and I thought I would start at the beginning, really. So I know I can see, welcome again to the attendees. I know many of them have had a connection to TAP as it's known over the years, but many perhaps are less familiar and sort of interested in the area and not necessarily working in the field in terms of research. I wanted to start by asking about that original moment. I mean, TAP's kind of a little bit over 10 years old now, 11 years old. And I know, Gui, you were kind of perhaps involved earliest. I wondered if you could say something about what that original need was, how that was sort of identified and then transformed into Trans-Asia Photography Review as it was known at the time, around 2010 or so.
Yes, I actually got to know the funding editor, Sandra Matthews, I believe as early as in 2008, when I was still a graduate student. So at the time when I met her, she was about to launch this journal. I wasn't aware, actually, she was one of the authors I already read about. She's actually one of the first person who wrote about Chinese photography in English language. I believe published in After Image like many, many years ago. So Sandra, this in a way is really a labor of love and responsibility, I think. Sandra is trained as a studio photographer. She was very interested in photography beyond the Euro-American context. And really wanted, first and foremost, to educate herself about these subjects. But at the time, as many of you, even though I cannot see your lovely faces, maybe many of you in the audience also know, 12 years ago or 13 years ago, the field of Asian photography was a very different one. There were maybe less than a handful of books on this subject. And so there was at the time no PhD students who wrote dissertations on the subject. So Sandra started the Trans-Asian Photography Review, and I want to emphasize the word review in the very beginning of this journal as a way really to kind of, she imagined this as a forum where those of us who are in the English language speaking academic world could reach out, exchange, communicate, and share about the studies on Asian photography with our, Sandra actually put a special emphasis on our colleagues in Asia. So as you can see in the early days of the photography, even though this project, now looking back, it's almost a kind of a beautiful example of frugal digital humanities, because the initial budget was very, very small one. And even with such limited resources, Sandra actually managed to reach out and initiated a few translation projects. And at the time, the reviews of new publications, exhibitions, and even conferences was a very important component of the journal. So in a way, somebody like me who did not write a dissertation on photography, now we have amazing young scholars who are really properly trained photo scholars, Shu Xiachen in Australia, Stephanie Tong in the US, and many others. Actually, the list could go on. And I'm just talking about the ones in the field of Chinese photography. But at the time, translation photography really is basically the window for me to make sure I keep up with the field, with what's happening in the outer world, and also very importantly to push me. As you know, I'm a kind of China studies person, and it's very easy for us to become very Sinocentric. It's also a very important force and kind of a facilitating platform for me to make sure I understand it's always a kind of a transnational, transcultural construction and flow of these visual cultures of a modern era. So, so that's the early history of translation photography. Is that a, we can talk more actually, especially if you have questions in the audience. But that's the origin basically of this journal. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. I will remind people, one of the benefits of the Zoom kind of format is you can post questions at any time. So I'd invite you, if you do have something in mind that you've brought to the table, as it were, today, please do post it in the Q&A, and I'm happy to sort of take questions as we go along, weave them into our conversation. I wanted to start at the beginning as well, because Gui, in the most current issue, which is focused around Asia. So for those unaware, the new issues under this editorship have been themed around kind of investigating the trans, Asia, and photography. So 3 issues on each of those words. And in your introduction, Gui, you mentioned this roundtable that was part of the first issue. And so I thought I would look back at that, and I was really interested that what this roundtable did was it sent out a kind of questionnaire or a question to, I can't remember the exact number now. There's, it seems like 10 or 12 scholars with many different responses. And first of all, what you immediately recognize is that there are people working in very different fields, people coming from visual studies, from photography history, from anthropology. And that's something that's reflected a little bit in our own series, our lecture series this year, which is interesting. T, I know when we were talking earlier last week, you mentioned as well that you're somebody who comes from sort of literature, literary studies and theory. So I think that's an interesting sort of comment as well on the diversity of the journal. And I think what's happening now is a reflection in some ways of the maturity of that situation. But I picked up a little bit on something that Chris Binney had written. So Christopher Binney is also our 3rd speaker in the series this year, which is an interesting reason to look back on what he responded, coming very much how he responded, coming from his sort of anthropological research background. And the question that was sent around was, why Asian photography? So here's this new journal, Trans-Asian Photography Review, and they sent a question as to sort of asking, why do we even need this as a topic? And of course, it's provocative. And Chris sort of turned this on its head by saying, must we be forever condemned to study territories rather than networks? And I thought that's a really interesting place to start today, this idea of territories versus networks. And he writes at much more length about traditionally the kind of territorialization that comes with photography and its history. And of course, he's pointing in the direction of colonial sort of expansion, but also, the way that we replicate that kind of domination and so on. And so I was wondering, how you would kind of respond to that sort of question today, and looking at your introduction to the first new issue, trans. You also, you spoke at length, or you wrote at length about the meaning of trans and the way that it can sort of transcend these sorts of issues around territorialization, but other sort of fixed structures. And so You said, for example, trans has the potential not only to widen research methods and interdisciplinary approaches to photography, but also to broaden the languages in which we speak about photography. So I was going to sort of point this to a question in your direction and say, how would you respond to Chris's kind of point around territories and networks, and how does that relate to something maybe that you've been doing with the journal at this point going forward?
Well, that's a very challenging question. I mean, it's worth noting that Chris Pinney remains on the journal despite kind of the desire to turn its kind of original premise on its head. I'm going to just take a step back to kind of reflect on one of the reasons why we decided to organize the first 3 special issues around each of the 3 terms: trans, Asia, and photography. In part, it was meant to kind of reflect back on the last 10 years and mark the next steps forward. For me personally, it was about defamiliarizing the term. And to be honest, initially I kept thinking, well, why trans? Of all the terms, why not inter-Asia? Why not just call it Asia photography? Trans seemed such a, for me, kind of a strange, even queer word, in the sense that people truly understand queer beyond sexuality. It's kind of a divergence from kind of these norms. And maybe this is kind of what was hinted at the outset, right? A way of troubling images, but also troubling Asia. That was confirmed by Sandra Matthews, who really felt that Asia needed that modifier. It needed, like, from the outset, this is kind of without yet finding the language at a time before kind of the field had been established, a way of trying to conceptualize kind of a model for researching Asian photography that wasn't just rooted in territory. That's what the trans, in putting together this special issue, that's what I understood trans to actually do. Trans doesn't operate, it doesn't have any meaning on its own. As I started to better understand, it can only function as a modifier, as a prefix, but it has kind of a conceptual value that is, limited. It's both kind of the advantages, its openness, and its disadvantages is precisely its capaciousness. So it could be, as the special issue pointed out, translation, the trans-specific, the transmedial, a way of kind of thinking through kind of forms of sexuality beyond that established by kind of a globalizing norm. But my own orientation, and one that is quite different from the first 10 years of trans-Asia photography, has been to think about kind of the trans-Pacific currents of critique. My own background has really been in Asian American studies originally, and that diasporic component, while a part of trans-Asia photography in its original formulation, wasn't necessarily emphasized, and this was something that was brought out in greater with greater emphasis subsequently.
Yeah, no, I also picked up on, in your introduction, you point to the potential for trans to be the new post, and the sort of, the potential problematics around these sorts of prefixes. But I'd like to connect that idea, which I think is already kind of troubled with the issue and the divergence in research that's featured. But I'd like to connect this idea of the post and this issue of sort of theory to my next question, which I'll point to you, Gui, because it relates, I think, a little bit more to the Asia special issue, which is the current one. Looking back at the roundtable, there was another comment which was very different coming from Avik Sen. And I'm going to look at my notes to sort of quote, because I think the point here, it is about the forms of domination in the study of photography itself. And so Avik wrote, non-Asia looks at Asia in a certain way, and therefore Asia looks at and projects itself like that too. A couple of centuries ago, this was called colonialism or imperialism. And then Said called it Orientalism. Now it's called context. And the right-minded, well-intentioned, academically respectable sound of the word obscures the structures of power, knowledge, funding that create this primacy of context. And I must admit, I've never sort of read something about context as a term, you know, linked in these ways to forms of kind of intellectual domination. But again, just as your point about post, T, you know, I thought it's interesting to, you know, to bring up this kind of critique because in some ways, you know, TAP has been such an influential kind of connector, I would say, not just a kind of influence on the field, but connecting people really between places and different disciplines. So how do you know, how do we trouble this sort of reality or impression? For instance, you know, is regionalism, you know, a new nationalism? How do we get around Asia? And you've already kind of pointed to trans as a modifier of that. But I'm interested in the role of photography and photo research and photo theory in being able to, I guess, speak back to and, you know, trouble this potential for context or other, you know, sorts of issues to be fixing, I guess, the discourse.
Olivia, you really asked the most challenging, but also, you know, most like questions that are challenging, but also fun to engage with. You're absolutely right. In a way, given that English language is still the, you know, the kind of the foundation for TAP's operation, it in a way is kind of looking in, if we still imagine Asia as that place. But I think both actually even under Sandra's editorialship and now with our team's effort, and most importantly with all the authors who participate, submit works to TAP, I think majority of us are fairly key and explicit in problematize the concept of Asia, right? So in a way, I think we kind of approach, well, the concept of regionality does not have to be, you know, it does not have to be imagined as external constructs, right? Either by, you know, imperialist gaze or by regionalists' own attempts to essentializing something. But instead, I think regionality could also be imagined as a set of contingencies. So I would like to actually have Chen Guangxin, the very famous Taiwan-based author, whose Asia as Method has been, you know, on the bookshelf or reading list of many of us. I think he once made this really beautiful point that Asia could be treated as this imaginary anchoring point, through which could become the reference point for different societies to looking at each other's experience. And through this process, the identity of the self can be transformed and the subjectivity could be reimagined. It's not a direct quote. I'm sorry, I don't have the note next to me, but roughly that, that point. So I think in many ways, we recognize how, you know, not just why Asia, but the question of Asia, when we kind of foreground emphasize this entity, it's also simultaneously the question of which Asia, who's Asia, you know. So we never try to, in a way, hide or smooth over the complexity and the loadedness of this term itself. And secondly, I'm really glad you brought out the issue of kind of theory, and also I think the comment on context probably refers to this ongoing perception, a very troubling one. Many of us are trying very hard to overcome or address it, which is the idea that there's this binary. The West is imagined as this body with reflective ability, right? To abstract, to pay attention to patterns, while the rest of the world, especially Asia, provides kind of specific idiosyncratic, localized case studies and materials. But I think in that regard, the discussion among scholars of STS, science and technology studies based in Asia, especially many of them work on Taiwan, actually already had very interesting rethinking on this problem. So in a way, that binary, we all know that's also a construct, right? So I think when we try to kind of deconstruct that binary, we also need to realize that kind of conflict between theory and case studies come out in the most poignant way when authors actually are facing, in a way, the kind of context of knowledge production that's not necessarily only about the case or the methods or the theory themselves, right? So for instance, when I was editing my special issue on Asia, I encountered many beautiful pieces. I think even the translation would be really gratifying and useful for TAP readers. But many of them actually, because in many parts of Asia, the writing of photography and the most cutting edge writing on photography that do not necessarily happen in the domain of universities or scholarly publications, right? So how to kind of, in a way, bridge these different, not only just tones, style of argument, the pre-existing expectation of your readers, but also even the mundane things, pragmatic things about the compensation for authors, right? So actually all these actually contextual elements for writing Asian photography also figures in when we think about the concept of Asia, because the genealogy of writing photography in Asia certainly is very different from the development of photo studies, either in America or in UK or in even Australia or many other nations. And the last I would like to emphasize, it is a good thing. Actually, it's a very exciting thing. TAP is, the three of us took over the editorship at a moment that's very different from the moment when Sandra first founded this journal. The field has grown, and also the writing on photography in many different formats, also the collection, the exhibition programs, the public awareness on the importance of historical photographs and also contemporary photo practices in Asian communities and in Asian diaspora communities have kind of reached a new stage, I would say. So TAP never imagined ourselves as the dominant voice. We continue to kind of take over Sandra's vision and imagine this as a place for exchange. And sometimes when the voices, when the voices represent very different understanding of photography in Asia, we also want them to show on our pages. So ultimately, I think any writing on photo history of Asia is polyphonic, right? Not only because the kind of so-called Western origin of photography as a media, as a technology, but also because of the training, the formative years of many photographers and the photo scholars, and also because of the continuing flow of people. So if we look at the pages of TAP, I think it's very clear if there is any underlying theme, it's the heterogeneity of Asia and the photography in Asia. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Gui. There's a lot of ground that's covered, and I like that you've also pointed to I guess, some examples of the challenges of trying to calibrate, practices. And that's something that I wanted to ask, even with particular examples, if we have time, to talk through some of the papers and so on, some of the writers that you're working with, because that's a lot of the work that a journal does, right? Like we see the final product, but there's all of those sorts of negotiations and mentorship, as well as, a lot in between. I'm conscious of the time, and I'd really like to bring Deepali, I'd really like to bring you into the conversation. I had a question here because I know that you're editing the next sort of upcoming issue, photography, that's focusing on, one might argue, the medium or practice, which of course is what the issue seeks to kind of question, I guess. But I was thinking about this because in the new sort of vision statement of Trans-Asian photography, there's a point that says, by focusing on photography practices beyond Euro-American frameworks, the journal foregrounds different ways of seeing and knowing as a way to advance new understandings of photography. And that's exactly, the sort of the work that certainly I'm very interested in. What does such research do to change our understanding of what we think of as the medium as a whole, or what we think of as, the history of photography as a whole, to get away exactly from the sorts of case study type approach that you were just talking about, Yi, where, Asia forms some kind of material or case study for a sort of framework that exists elsewhere and is practiced elsewhere. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the kinds of practices that are implicated, and I guess how these change our understanding of photography and its history, perhaps through your own experience editing the upcoming issue, and if there's any sort of research that you could give us a glimpse of, perhaps, as to how the journal is trying to think through this issue.
Yeah, so I'll just say that, yes, so the last of the 3 themed issues examining the title keywords, trans, Asia, and then photography, is coming out. It's not out yet, but we expect it out next month. And, it is admittedly a little weird to have a Journal of Photography doing a special issue on photography. I mean, normally this, you wouldn't do something like this. It would only make sense in this context as, as a kind of examination of the title keywords. And, it's maybe the most kind of expansive, where the directions in which the issue could have gone. But I think it's actually turned out quite interesting. And I think, like the other 2 title keywords, trans and Asia, I think by focusing on the term photography, I think one of the things this series of issues does is, show that that these words are not self-evident. There is not some sort of accepted, consolidated understanding of it. And one of the things I write about in my introduction is how the term photography itself and our understandings of photography as the field of photo studies broadly has gone forward. We haven't arrived at some consolidated understanding of photography that we, that we all agree on. In fact, if anything, it's become even more splintered. What does photography mean? I think, all of these various understandings of it far, far, far beyond a technology or just an analog image or just an image, thinking about photography, as an event, as a series of haptic and affective relationships, as a series of, social relationships between the maker, the sitter, the viewer, and, other beings. It's just, splintered in a lot of different directions. And so, I think building on what E and T have talked about, I think one of the things that's interesting is that this question of why Asian photography, that was posed more than 10 years ago, in some ways we're still there trying to answer that question, but in a different way. I think the nature of the question has shifted. So it's not so much, why Asian photography, and we all know what Asia and photography mean, but it's sort of like why Asia photography, or really what is at stake in thinking about Asia and photography together. And in fact, next week, we'll be hosting a program where many of our board members are going to be addressing that very question, which I'm quite excited about. But this in our kind of mission statement describing TAP in the new website we launched about a year ago, it says that we think of Asia as conceived here as a territory, a network, or a cultural imaginary. And I think we kind of also think of photography that way. It could very easily be a territory, a network, or a cultural imaginary. And so the issue tries to dig at that and underscore the fact that the journal is it's not an additive project. We're not adding examples to the history of photography here. It's not even a revisionist project, I would argue. But in fact, it is about fundamentally using these two things, Asia and photography, in the same frame, whatever relationship that might be, and fundamentally changing understandings of photography. And so, for example, and I will give some examples, maybe just a little preview of some of the articles in the journal and how they might be doing this. So, some examples are, we have Rahul Sharma has written a research article on the transnational materiality of Japanese painted photos. So the very bits of material, the dyes, the paper itself, that goes into this genre that has it's kind of, this type of painted photography, these kinds of dyes have been associated with Japanese photography since the 19th century. And he argues, in fact, these very materials are transnational from their start. They're being made in Germany, they're being made in Western Europe. And it's sort of interesting how, despite their transnational nature, there's somehow this localized identity that gets attached to the certain form. So he's, kind of unpacking that. Menglin Chen writes on spirit photography in China as a way to shift the relationship between photo and the real from one could argue, Western-centric notion of photography as capturing the shadow to one that's about capturing the spirit. So sort of this very fundamental idea of photography that came out of a Western European historiography, which was about capturing the shadow and completely, and shifting it and thinking about it in a very different way. What exactly is it capturing is, the fundamental question. Another example, Franz Pritchard has written about the installation art of contemporary artist Komatsu Hiroko, and argued that the type of layeredness of photography in her installations can be understood through an analogy with Japanese noise music. And so thinking about the way meaning is produced in this installation and likening it more to an experience that's both audible, but also about the haptic. So Japanese noise music, you experience not only through listening, but through feeling it, the vibrations and the feedback loop that happens in the speakers has this layering effect that is productive and progressive. And so thinking about, that experience of a photo installation, not just again as an image you look at, but in fact a space that you go into and you experience on different levels. So all of these are about kind of shifting some of those basic assumptions and perhaps understandings of what is photography, and trying to dislodge it and trying to create a different space for it. Yeah, so this is sort of some of the ways in which, I guess, for me, that point to the potential of the journal. This is not just about adding Asian examples to the history of photography, but it's about actually using this thinking about Asia and photography in the same frame as a way to fundamentally rethink photo history.
I thinking about the rethinking of photo history. I will first of all also remind our attendees, if they'd like to post questions and so on, please do. I'm sure many of you have your own sorts of thoughts and experiences to bring to the conversation. I wanted to get to the point of the digital, I guess, and the fact that, and this is something we talked about in preparation for today's discussion, where two things really. One is the impact of the digital on the field itself and on the research in the field, and what your perspective from the journal would be, even in terms of, are you seeing proposals coming through that are starting to deal with this, in what ways? Even Deepali, what you were just talking about in terms of relationships between sort of photography, installation, and noise music, to me, point to really interesting ways that might, that digital practices might be somehow impacting, on where we think of photography happening. So that's my first part of that question. And then I hope that we can get to also talk a little bit about the digital, what it means for the journal itself, because it has been, it has always been sort of a digital native, living online, it's open access, and it remains so. And it's, I know that you're thinking about ways that might shape the form that the journal takes going forward, and so I'd love to get to that point as well. But first of all, in terms of the digital's impact on the field from your perspective, and I'm not sure who'd like to jump in there. T, I don't know if that's something you want to talk to, or
I can get started. We have been mulling, it hasn't, and don't take that as like, okay, this is the next call. But we have been mulling over a special issue on digitality. It hasn't yet been conceptualized, but it's certainly kind of the next, one of the future directions that we wish to pursue. So far, what we've seen are projects that are about digitizing archives, so preservation of kind of heritage materials in various sites, and kind of the practices of doing so, what that might mean for writing new histories of Asian photography. So there's kind of one area, but we haven't been really seeing what I had expected to see, material on, say, kind of smartphone uses, and how that kind of proliferation of vernacular photography is transformed kind of conceptualizations of photography more broadly. That's absolutely fascinating. I would like to see material in that regard. As a side note, actually, we were, Deepali and I did a side project. It's in line with Trans-Asia photography. We called it Invisible Photographies, basically on the hypervisible and what it renders invisible. And this was one of our pandemic projects. What do you do when all of your plans for the journal, plans to overcome its Canadian, North American orientation by reaching out to networks at photo exhibitions around Asia? That was kind of our plan for being able to kind of build a larger community, right? We couldn't do that. We wanted to do an exhibit, and we realized that it had to be a digital exhibit, but by around the first year of the pandemic, it had become very clear to us that what a digital exhibit usually looks like is another website. And we just were not interested in that. So we started to, Deepali had a network with, or had a relationship already with somebody with a very successful Instagram account, Brown History. And we partnered with him and put together an exhibit. Deepali took the lead in putting together the digital exhibition through kind of the Instagram website. So we had like some thoughts about kind of how what that might mean. What does an exhibit look like on Instagram? How did that change kind of how you see images, how you engage with images? What is a measure of success and engagement that is quite different? And how you perceive, how you read and view the image together. So this is kind of a jumble of things thrown right at you about the various components of the digital. But even though it might seem like they're disconnected, they actually aren't disconnected, right? It speaks to the journal's larger mission, which is to kind of connect with photography, not just within the academic setting. And if that means partnerships with folks who are kind of rethinking how digital platforms change how people view, how they make and how they share photographs, and how they connect with photographs. That was actually one of the major things that I learned from participating in that project. The other is like basically learning from others. I mean, the kind of scholarship that we grew up on in a field that was barely forming at the time is basically analog. I mean, we do work with the digital, but we really very much invite scholars who have been thinking in a more focused way about the digital to come to the journal and teach us more.
Deepali, I don't know if you want to add something. I guess T is just pointing to your sort of curatorial experience there. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I'll point out that Nick has also posted a link to invisible photographies in the chat for those who are sort of curious to bring that up at the same time.
Oh, good. Nick's been doing such a good job of posting exactly the resources we need in the chat. Thank you, Nick. I'll just add a couple things. And yeah, so the Invisible Photographies exhibition is archived on the Brown History handle on Instagram. On my Instagram, I also have it archived on my stories if anybody wants to go and see what that was. But just in terms of the digital and the journal, it's, it was really important to Sandra right from the start of the journal to have it be online and to have it be free. And, this is part of what E was talking about, of trying to imagine an audience that's not only academics and not only based in North America, and acknowledging our colleagues in Asia who are not only academics, but artists, curators, etc., who need access to this and are contributors to the journal and have been, but don't necessarily, can't get to it when it's behind a paywall or can't get to it when it's a hard copy. And so that vision was part of the journal right from the start. And Sandra had a wonderful partner in that, Michigan University Press, who helped her achieve that. We're happy also to announce that as of this upcoming issue, the one themed on photography, in fact, we have a new publishing partner in Duke University Press. It's been wonderful to be able to partner with them further on keeping the journal open access as well as online. But the design is going to change a bit, and it's interesting to see how, in fact, our journal is going to be, I think, only one of two that they have. They have a bunch of online journals, but many of them are still conceived of as a hard copy. So articles are laid out as a PDF, images are placed, and so there's a design element there following the concept of a printed book. But for ourselves, in fact, they're experimenting with something very different, which is, there isn't going to be any PDF button that you can press and pop up a printable version of the article, although of course you can print it. But in fact, it's a fully digital online version, which is actually going to give us some freedom in how and what we publish. So for example, video could be embedded into an article. And that's not going to print out in a PDF, or a series of images arranged as a carousel that you can flick through. And so there isn't this, so there's a bit more freedom there. You mentioned the article, Franz Pritchard's on the contemporary installations connected to noise music. And in fact, we played with the idea of including an audio clip or something, or even a video clip of noise music to introduce to people. But unfortunately, we just ran out of time, and then there was rights issues to be dealt with. So we didn't quite get that, but at least the idea was there, so that hopefully we can, continue to actually act on those things. And I think, it's an important element in some ways meeting photography where it is. Photo practice today being so diverse and so broad ranging that in some ways it wouldn't make sense to have a journal that thinks in analog in a world where photo is not that anymore.
Sorry, when we were talking before today, and you said something that I kind of kept in my notes, to meet photography where it is, which I thought was a very, it's also a provocation to ask, where is photography? And I'd like to ask that again from the perspective of the journal and this conversation around the digital. What are the sorts of practical aspects of trying to meet photography where it is for what you're doing? How does that come up in your conversations and your planning? You talked about the difficulty of COVID sort of changing your plans. What does that look like for a journal based on photography on and from and related to Asia as a sort of concept? How do you plan to kind of deal with that going forward?
Anybody want to talk about that?
It's open. Guyi, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. It's always difficult to answer a question about what we aspire to do, because we actually have many plans and ideas. One thing I do want to emphasize, even though I guess by this point everyone already are tired of sharing about the difficulties we all lived through during the COVID. Olivier, you yourself curated an exhibition during the COVID time. So but I do want to emphasize again, actually part of the reason the three of us were so excited to take upon this editorial task is also being in Asia, meeting photographers there, meeting the many new how you call that, alternative publishing houses, photographer collectives, alternative photo festivals, all these things that we observed that that was thriving, at least before COVID temporarily shut everything down. We were keen to be there, both as observer, as allies, and hopefully to some degree also as facilitators. That hasn't happened yet, and it seems like this summer is still not quite possible, but I think it is certainly in the future of TAB. Another thing I also want to emphasize is you already pointed out the problems of regionalism, right? And I think one dream of at least the TAB editors is we often think, we continue to have a review section, even though it's very difficult to actually manage to find the reviewers and high quality articles on exhibition reviews, but we are committed to continue to have that session. So we were thinking that it's not just important for TAB to review major exhibitions on and off Asian photography or of photography in Asia, but we also would love to see scholars, writers, photographers, curators, critics invested in trans-Asia photography to kind of cast our gaze or observation back at the other parts of photo history or photo practices. So, major publications in photo studies, exhibitions that, at least by title, does not seem to be particularly pertinent to Asian photography, we would love TAB to have voices, have engagement with those phenomenon as well. am I running out of time? We have like another 15 minutes, right?
We've got a little bit more, yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to add one thing about the digitality of photography. To be honest, the three of us were a little bit surprised that we haven't received kind of a lot of submissions on digital photography. But I guess in a way, it's also not surprising in the sense that the general overall field is still young. And you probably are aware of so far the most kind of focused study on Instagram photography, you know, Lev Manovic, he actually used Korea so as one key example in his analysis, but a major criticism of his mode of reading large set of data, of course, is almost the total disappearance of context, right? of any understanding of the locality of these phenomena. So I'm actually hopeful. I really, maybe it's unfounded optimism, but I believe that very soon we will see a lot of interesting new studies on digital photography, especially considering the most recent Asian studies annual conference I went to. I see an unmistakable media term. You know, there's so many scholars begin to look at their subject from the media analysis point of view. So I think it's really just a matter of time that you will find more contents of that nature on those topics with those kind of questions on the pages, on the websites of TAP. Yeah.
It's also really difficult work to do sometimes, right? Like this is one of the other things that we're not, you know, that's one of the things that makes it challenging. I think I've just this morning I was looking at an article that's kind of looking at trying to do sort of like, you know, digital archaeology. So looking at old websites of oral history stuff in Japan to do with, you know, former mine sites and oral histories around mining in Japan, which, you know, how do you do that kind of research when the internet itself has shifted and evolved? Where do you find those sorts of sites to research is a difficult question. And that to me also points to the challenges, which is where I wanted to kind of finish, because you did mention that, Guyi, when we were talking earlier, and I'd invite all of you to sort of respond, I guess, to what the challenges and difficulties have been, and how that might be generative or productive. And we've talked about some of that today already, but I wonder if you could, yeah, say a little bit in the minutes that we have left about the sorts of challenges or difficulties that you've sort of faced and hopefully overcome or are unraveling. And there also, I would point out, there are practical challenges, but I think also some of the intellectual, the conceptual challenges we've addressed already, but I'd love to hear of more that we maybe haven't touched on.
You know, just, I guess, name the elephant in the room, right? Like one of the challenges of realizing our vision is that precisely our location in the global north. And so the ongoing challenge is really to fulfill our commitment to addressing kind of the power inequities within kind of academia, the art world, the curatorial world. This is, you know, something that we're acutely aware of, given kind of our own privileged location within institutions, and something that we continue to grapple with, like how would we do that? And part of our mission too, it's not declared on the journal's vision, is to kind of establish the journal, like our aim is to establish kind of the journal as a long time, to continue to maintain its sustainable future, so that the next set of editors doesn't have to worry about the mundane things that are way too boring for us to share with you right now. Like somebody mentioned that they wanted to see images. I'm like, oh no, we didn't do a slideshow. We should have done that. I started to play with video because we can't afford someone to do promotions. So I start to put together some images. That's just a digression here, but really our hope is, you know, one day, sooner rather than later, that this journal would be taken up in a truly global sense.
Mm. I mean, one thing I've noticed in the current issue, just for people who are curious, is, you know, there's two articles in translation. One by Guo Lixin, which I thought was interesting, just because we've invited him to speak in Australia just last year, related to the project that you mentioned, Gui, and a good example of somebody who's, you know, really seminal in the field in Taiwan, and yet so little of their work is available. His work is available in English. Despite the fact that he did study, you know, overseas and has studied, but that's often the case, right? We find people kind of distance from their time of overseas study. Gui, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't mean to. You can finish your thoughts and then I'll jump in. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to point to, there's a couple of questions that are sort of interconnected in the Q&A. So I might hand back to you to continue your train of thought, and then I'll finish with that question. Oh, you're muted again, sorry.
Sorry, I just quickly add some of the difficulties TAP, actually the three of us encountered when we took it over and tried to guarantee the longevity of the journal as an open access thing. I think actually ties back to what Olivier, you just said about, you know, when you look at the rapid change of internet itself, right? So sustainability is not just the issue, the problem, the challenge faced by an academic journal. And I think in a way, I'll just be blunt. One huge difficulty I encountered is I realized some of the amazing authors I reached out based in Asia who would be amazing contributors to TAP, but there is a kind of different ecosystem, and these amazing young writers who normally do not have a institutional position, actually the small payment from art journals or other various publications or exhibition catalogs is a major kind of livelihood for their well-being, right, for their survival. So for TAP, an academic journal, peer-reviewed, we absolutely do not pay our author. It's almost unethical for me to kind of solicit their fruit of labor. So I think it's actually ultimately ties back to the question of as a word, we have to figure out a proper way to compensate for cultural production, especially in the digital world. That's a much larger issue than TAP, this one particular open access journal. But I think it's actually related, and I hope that on TAP's pages we will also kind of continue to explore and reflect on the very reality of our journal. Yeah.
It's interesting because you're pointing there also to this, in some ways, you mentioned the ecosystems, and I thought that's a really interesting way of putting it, because there is, ecosystems in terms of way of working, but also, interests. And so on the one hand, we're here talking about, a surprise that there isn't more research coming through on the digital. And I think it is happening, but one might counter that there's been a huge interest in, historical or vintage photographic processes. And I'm thinking about, Taiwan, I'm thinking about China, to a lesser degree in Japan, but just in terms of my own sort of experience. And I'm using that as a segue to the questions in the Q&A, because there's a question there about, as an analog person, I wonder if we can so easily leave behind the analog. I don't know if that's exactly what you're suggesting, but such photography has been the source of so many images of Asia, the impact of which is still being felt. Nonetheless, it's important to have other forms of publication, they say, that move beyond the limits of a certain Western academic tradition. I'd like to connect this to the other question that's there about the haptic that was mentioned. And of course, in a different sense, perhaps, you've co-edited a book called Feeling Photography. So I think the haptic is an interesting point that in my own sort of limited experience, I know that in places like Taiwan, there's absolutely beautiful, analog publication that's happening, which seems to try and replicate in some ways the haptic experience of, the photo on the page, even down to the type of paper stock that's used and so on, which is a completely, in some ways it's a labor of love that's unsustainable, from the position of a journal. But I'm wondering if that's something that, how do you connect to that kind of ecosystem, let's say? Are there ways that you can navigate that, or introduce perhaps even those sorts of experiences or trends or tendencies?
Maybe I can just quickly address the question of the analog. I want to get away from that, and thank you to Helen for posing that question. I absolutely didn't suggest that we needed to get away from the analog, but thinking about it just in terms of the publishing of the journal, and trying to use the range of digital possibilities to be able to actually reflect through the journal itself, through the publication of the journal, the range of photographic practice. And that absolutely includes the analog, and certainly in places of Asia, not only the analog, but especially studio photography is still an extremely important source of image production when many people don't still have a personal camera, although the smartphone has, I think, really changed a lot of that stuff. But I'm talking about things like, for example, and maybe this connects to the issue of the haptic too, in the upcoming issue, there's also is an article about vernacular photography in the early Turkish Republic. And the article focuses on not only the image on the front of these images, but the inscriptions on the back. And so we're managing that as a series of images that publish the front and then the back, the front, the back, the front, the back. But wouldn't it be interesting to, in the issue, be able to publish the fronts, and then maybe as a viewer, you click on it and it shows the back. So there's maybe a different kind of engagement with how images appear in the journal that might approach or approximate the experience of the image, as the photograph, as a material object itself. So definitely agree that the analog is very much relevant here, but that in the publishing field, the digital offers possibilities for the experience of photography that perhaps analog publishing can't.
So Olivier, are you asking to what extent kind of the digital can render a haptic experience or an effective one? I'm just trying to...
Not directly, but I think that Deepali, your point there about this sense of kind of revelation of the flip of the image, etc., does bring that a little bit into play, which I think is interesting, that you can have that sense of the different faces of the photo as an object. But T, did you want to add anything there as to, I guess, wrapping up the conversation, bringing it back to you?
Well, it strikes me that the touch screens provide kind of like a return to kind of a haptic experience of the visual and of photography, and kind of the printing. There's so many memorialization movements around the world. The printing of family portraits and the touching of those portraits is a way of rendering kind of the connection to kind of the person who's lost. So it's really fascinating to think through kind of the change and also continuities between analog and digital, because I'm not yet ready to kind of dismiss the haptic or even the indexical from the digital. but you're sparking ideas for that CFP on the digital.
Well, I think that's not the only way in which this has been a generative kind of discussion. So I'm conscious of time, and I know for those unaware, in Toronto, it's late in the evening, night. So I'm going to wrap things up here. I want to thank everyone joining us. I also like to thank each of you, Thi, Deepali, Yi, for taking time. It's been, I think, it's difficult to bring together different schedules, etc., and yet we've managed to do that very generously. So it's wonderful to have you. I wish we could all, of course, meet here, despite in an analog way. But with that, I also remind people listening that this has been recorded, and so we'll be able to make it available, which is great. But keep an eye also on Transasia Photography. As you've heard, it's all free online and open access. I believe that there are some events planned for the next issue coming up. Is that correct? You can say
we have a launch event next week where several of our board members will be talking about what is at stake in thinking about Asia and photography together. And the authors, some of the authors in the upcoming issue will just present brief statements about the article. So it is a bit of a sneak peek. And that event on May 26th, excuse me. If anybody's interested, you can find that on eventbrite.com and just search Transasia Photography.
That's great. Thanks, Deepali. And so with that, I thank Nick again for making all of this possible, as usual. And thank you all again for joining. I will remind you that our next speaker in the series is Chris Binney, which will be in September. So there's a bit of a break in the mid-year, as we usually have. So join us again then. Thanks again, everyone.